The dog stopped in the middle of the forest and refused to move, not barking, not afraid, just staring at an old oak tree like it was alive. When the officer saw the faded mark carved into the bark, her heart froze, because it was the same mark from a missing child case everyone had given up on 30 years ago. Before we begin, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Rain drifted through the pines like slow breath. A county road disappeared into fog, and the woods held that old, listening silence that makes a person lower their voice without knowing why. Laura Bennett was 35, and she carried her life the way some people carried a heavy coat, quietly, by habit, with a small tilt of the shoulders. In the patrol car's pale dashboard glow, her dark navy jacket looked almost black, plain and unmarked, the zipper half raised against the cold. Black tactical pants, worn leather boots that had seen too many wet nights. Her hair was pulled low at the nape, practical, no loose strands to catch on a branch. The radio crackled now and then, more static than speech. She was alone except for Shadow, the German shepherd in the back seat. Older now, thick black and tan coat dulled by years, ears still alert like a promise he refused to break. Shadow had been K9 once. He lived with Laura after his handler died because dogs like him didn't do well with goodbyes that came too fast. Laura didn't either. She drove the forest line slowly, not looking for trouble, just keeping the dark honest. Still, her hand rested near the flashlight on her belt, and her thoughts kept circling the same familiar ache, the cases that never came home. Shadow's head lifted before Laura saw anything. His nose worked the air, drawing in the wet scent of bark and old leaves, then something sharper, metal maybe, or the memory of it. He gave one low sound, not quite a bark, more like a warning spoken under his breath. Laura eased to the shoulder and killed the headlights. The engine ticked as it cooled. In the hush that followed, Shadow rose without being told. He didn't whine, he didn't pace. He simply stood rigid, weight forward, staring through the rear window into the fog, as if the woods had called his name. "Easy," Laura said softly, and her voice was steady in the way it becomes when you've practiced steadiness for years. She opened the door and stepped into wet gravel. The rain touched her cheeks like cold fingers. Shadow was already at her side, no harness, only an old black leather collar with a scratched tag. When Laura started toward the car again, just to reposition, just to get a better angle, Shadow moved in front of her and caught the fabric of her pant leg between his teeth. A gentle pull, not aggression, a message. It was a K9 habit, the kind that said, "Not this way, this way." They walked under the trees, flashlight beam cutting a narrow tunnel through the mist. Shadow led without rushing, as if he feared that speed would break whatever thread he was following. And then he stopped. In front of them stood a massive oak, its trunk thick as a small room, roots exposed like knuckles. On the lower bark, half hidden by moss and rain-darkened wood, was a mark, faint, carved long ago, softened by time but still there. Laura felt her chest tighten, not with fear exactly, but recognition, the way a song can bring. You back to a year you thought you'd buried. She knelt close, her gloved fingers hovering just above the lines. A simple shape, a crude symbol. She had seen it once in a case file, printed in grainy black and white, scribbled in the margin as a detail no one could use. Ethan Moore, missing since 1995. 9 years old. A name that had become a quiet legend in the county, spoken the way people speak of storms and funerals. Laura had been a teenager then, reading newspapers at the kitchen table, telling herself the world could not be that careless. That case was one of the reasons she put on a badge. It was the first time she understood that a child could vanish and the earth could keep turning anyway. Shadow's body vibrated with tension beside her, his stare fixed on the base of the tree where a strange bulge rose beneath the bark, misshapen and wrong, as if the oak had swallowed something it shouldn't have. Laura stood slowly, The rain tapped her jacket. The air smelled like wet wood and iron. Shadow barked once, sharp, final, then went silent again, watching her, waiting. Laura brought the flashlight closer and ran the beam along the bulge. The bark there looked older, stretched, bruised by time. She pressed her palm against it and felt, beneath the rough surface, a smooth coldness that didn't belong to any living tree. Metal. Her breath fogged in front of her face, and she realized she had been holding it. In that moment, she did not think about promotions or paperwork or how ridiculous it might sound when she called it in. She thought about a boy's name on a page. She thought about mothers who die without answers. She thought about how some things wait in the dark until someone finally listens. Shadow stepped closer until his shoulder touched her leg, steadying her without trying. Laura reached for her radio, thumb hovering over the button. "Dispatch," she said, voice low but clear. "I need a unit and a fire saw out on County Line Road. I found something." She looked once more at the carved symbol, the oak, the bulge, and the dog who would not let the night pass like any other. And for the first time in years, Laura let herself believe a different ending might be possible. Not because the world was kind, but because Shadow was certain. Rain softened into a steady whisper. Floodlights cut pale cones through the mist, and the old oak stood brighter now, as if the night had decided to tell the truth. Laura Bennett waited beside the tree while the first backup arrived. 2 patrol officers stepped out, both men in their 40s, shoulders rounded by years of night shifts and quiet disappointments. One was Deputy Mark Hale, broad, graying at the temples, voice calm but tired. The other, Officer Tom Rivera, lean, younger in the face but older in the eyes, his jacket zipped high against the cold. They listened without interruption as Laura spoke. Her words were measured, careful, as though she feared the forest might be offended by too much certainty. Shadow stayed pressed against her leg, his black and tan coat damp, ears alert, gaze never leaving the swollen bark. When Laura mentioned the metal beneath the wood, Hale exchanged a look with Rivera, skepticism mixed with respect. They had learned, like she had, that the strange calls were often the ones that mattered. A fire truck arrived last, tires hissing on wet gravel. The fireman who stepped down was older, maybe 60, beard silvered and trimmed short, hands steady as habit. His name was Earl Thompson. He wore a faded yellow coat, smelled faintly of gasoline and pine sap, and spoke little. Men like Earl saved their words for later. The saw began its low growl, a sound that felt almost rude in the quiet. Laura flinched at first, then steadied herself. Wood chips fell like tired snow. The smell of fresh-cut oak mixed with rain and oil, sharp and grounding. Shadow barked once, then again, pacing in a tight circle, every muscle alive. Laura rested a hand on his shoulder, feeling the warmth beneath his wet fur. She remembered another dog, years ago, barking at a creek bed where nothing was found. She remembered the apology she'd whispered into the dark after calling off that search. This time, she told herself, listen longer. As the saw bit deeper, the bark gave way to something smooth and dark. Metal. Earl slowed, then stopped entirely. With gloved fingers, he brushed away the last clinging wood. Letters appeared, faint but legible, stamped into rusted steel. Ethan Moore, missing since 1995. The words settled into the night like a held breath finally released. Laura felt her knees weaken. She had read that name on paper so many times it felt unreal seeing it etched into something solid. Rivera swore softly. Hale removed his cap. No one spoke for a moment. Even the rain seemed to hesitate. They worked the box free with care, easing it from the oak as if the tree might feel the loss. The metal was cold, heavier than it looked, edges softened by time. Laura took it into her hands, surprised by the tremor she couldn't stop. Inside, wrapped in a threadbare red scarf, lay a small wooden toy truck, its paint worn thin by small fingers. A school ID, the photo faded, but the smile unmistakable. And a folded note, sealed in. Yellowed plastic. Laura did not open it yet. She knew suddenly that this box was not an ending, but a marker, a voice that had waited decades to be heard. Shadow barked again, sharper now, his eyes bright with urgency. He circled the tree, nose to the ground, then returned to the box and sat, staring at Laura as if to say, "You see it now, but it's not all of it." Laura met his gaze and felt a quiet shame rise in her chest. For the years the case had been shelved, for the comfort of believing some stories simply stop. She stepped back from the tree and finally unfolded the note. The paper crackled softly. The words were cramped, careful, written by a child trying to be brave. Ethan wrote of running, of hiding, of a man who said he couldn't leave yet. He wrote that he was scared. He wrote that he would try again tomorrow. Laura's breath grew shallow as she read. She felt not like a detective uncovering evidence, but like a witness arriving too late to knock on a door. Hale placed a hand at her elbow, not to steady her body, but her resolve. "We keep going," he said quietly. Shadow had already moved to the far side of the oak, sniffing the ground where roots knotted thick and low. He pawed once, then twice, then looked back at Laura, waiting. The rain darkened the soil. Laura closed the box and held it to her chest. In that moment, she made a promise, not aloud, but deep enough to count. She would not let this be another name returned to a shelf. She nodded to Hale. "There's more," she said. Shadow barked once, satisfied, and began to dig. The rain thinned to a mist, and the forest breathed again. Light from the truck settled softly on wet leaves, and the old oak held its ground, patient, as if it had waited all these years for this moment to be spoken aloud. Laura Bennett unfolded the letter with hands that felt older than her 35 years. The plastic crinkled, a small sound, too loud in the quiet. The paper inside was yellowed, creased, the ink faint but stubborn. She read slowly. Ethan wrote about running through the trees, about hiding when his legs gave out, about a man who said he could not go home yet. The words were careful, the spelling uneven, like a child trying to sound brave for someone who might never come. When Laura reached the last lines, "If anyone finds this, please tell my mom I am still alive. I am trying to find my way out." Her breath caught, and for a moment she could not see the page through the blur in her eyes. She lowered the letter and felt the night press in around her. This was not evidence. This was a voice, one that had waited quietly while the world moved on. Shadow sat close, his shoulder touching her knee, his dark eyes lifted to her face, steady and knowing, as if he understood the weight of what she held. The letter pulled Laura backward in time. She was 16 again, sitting at a kitchen table with a cup of coffee gone cold, reading about a boy who vanished into the woods and never came back. Ethan Moore had been the first name she learned that way, the first story that taught her how little comfort words could offer. She remembered her mother saying, "Some things aren't meant to be solved," and how that sentence had settled in Laura's chest like a challenge. Years later, in the academy, she had written Ethan's name in the margin of a notebook, a quiet promise to herself. Standing there now, with rain on her jacket and mud on her boots, she felt the distance between then and now collapse. All those years she believed it was too late, that the forest had already taken what it would not return. The letter told a different story, not of rescue, but of trying. And trying mattered. Hale watched her from a few steps back, his face lined, respectful, saying nothing. Rivera shifted his weight, eyes fixed on the ground. No one rushed her. Some moments, Laura knew, demanded to be carried gently. Shadow broke the stillness. Without warning, he rose and moved away from her, fast and purposeful, his nails clicking against wet roots. "Shadow," Laura said, not sharp, just surprised. He did not look back. He circled the oak once, nose low, then headed toward the darker side, where the lights fell short. His body language changed. No barking now, just focus. Laura felt a strange mix of fear and hope twist inside her. She folded the letter carefully and placed it back in the box, then handed it to Hale. "Hold this," she said, voice steady again. She followed Shadow, flashlight trembling slightly in her grip. He stopped at a patch of ground, thick with roots and moss, pawed once, then dug. The earth was soft from the rain. Dirt flew. Shadow worked without sound, breath heavy, muscles straining, as if something older than training had taken over. Laura knelt beside him, her knees sinking into mud. She did not know what she expected to find. Bones. Nothing. A mistake. But she knew with a certainty that surprised her that Shadow was not wrong. As Shadow dug, Laura felt the shape of her own belief shift. She had spent years learning to close doors, to tell herself that closure was a kindness. Now she saw how often that was just another way of turning away. The hole grew deeper. Roots snapped with dull cracks. Shadow's pause slowed, then stopped. He stood very still, head lowered, listening. Laura held her breath. The forest seemed to lean closer. In that pause, she felt something loosen inside her, not hope exactly, but permission. Permission to believe that some truths arrive late, and that late does not mean meaningless. She placed her hand on Shadow's back, warm and solid beneath the rain, and whispered, "I'm here." Shadow did not look at her. He stared into the dark earth, waiting. And Laura waited with him, no longer afraid of what might come next, only certain that they had crossed a line together, out of forgetting and into remembering. Rain thickened again, turning the ground to dark paste. Floodlights hummed softly. Breath rose and fell in pale clouds, and the forest held its silence like a held prayer. Shadow dug as if the earth itself had called him by name. He worked past pain, past command, past the old rules that once kept him precise and safe. Mud clung to his legs. Blood marked the soil in thin, honest lines. Laura called his name once, then stopped. She knew that tone in him, the one that said the choice had already been made. She dropped to her knees beside him, the flashlight shaking in her hand, its beam sliding over roots thick as wrists. Each scrape sounded louder than it should have. Earl stood back, hands folded at his waist, eyes steady, saying nothing. Hale murmured orders into the radio, his voice low, almost apologetic to the night. The hole widened. The smell changed, from rain and leaves to something older, colder, like a room unopened for years. Shadow paused, head lowered, listening. Laura felt it then, the quiet click inside her chest when fear gives way to resolve. She reached out and rested her palm on Shadow's back. "I'm with you," she said. The words surprised her with how true they felt. The roots gave way to a wooden edge, not a coffin, not a grave, a door. The planks were gray with age, warped, their grain raised like tired skin. Laura brushed away mud and found an iron latch, rusted but intact. Earl knelt beside her, joints complaining softly, and set his shoulder to the task. The wood groaned, then yielded with a sound that felt like a sigh. Darkness spilled upward, heavy and complete. Rivera leaned in, his breath held, eyes searching for shapes that might end the story the way most stories end. Laura did not look away. She had learned over the years that turning away does not soften what comes next. Shadow did not wait for light. He slipped into the opening, careful, deliberate, his body easing into the dark as if he had always known where it led. Seconds stretched. Laura counted her breaths. Then Shadow's tail moved, slow, uncertain. A sound followed. Not a bark. A soft exhale. Laura leaned closer, heart beating against her ribs, and saw it. A hand, thin as memory, pale beneath dirt, lying still at the edge of the beam. Shadow lowered his head and licked the fingers once, gently, like a greeting remembered. The hand moved. Just enough. A tremor. Laura felt her knees give, felt Hale's arm steady her without a word. "There's a pulse," Rivera said, disbelief roughening his voice. They moved carefully then, the way you move when the world has proven it can still surprise you. A paramedic arrived moments later. Susan Pike, late 50s, hair pulled back tight, jacket marked with years of use. Her voice was calm, practiced, kind. She slipped into the opening with a small light and a smaller prayer. The man inside was breathing, shallow but real. His beard was patchy, his hair long and matted, his frame reduced by time and hunger. When they lifted him, Laura caught a glimpse of his face. It was older, yes, but the bones were familiar. The boy from the photograph had not vanished. He had waited. Susan spoke softly as she worked, as if the words themselves were medicine. Shadow stayed close, watching every movement, his body finally still. Laura felt tears on her cheeks and did not wipe them away. She thought of all the nights she had driven past this road, believing the ending was already written. They laid the man on a stretcher beneath the lights. Rain dotted his cheeks like punctuation. Laura stood at his side, unsure of her place now that the impossible had happened. Shadow stepped forward and rested his chin on the stretcher's edge. The man stirred, his eyes opened, confused, wary, alive. He looked first at the lights, then at Laura's jacket, then at the dog. Something settled in his gaze, something like recognition finding its way home. His voice, when it came, was thin but certain. "The dog," he said. He came back. Laura bent closer, her tears falling freely now. "Yes," she whispered. He did. In that moment, the forest released its hold, not with noise or triumph, but with a simple truth returned to the living. Laura closed her eyes and made a promise she would keep, that no one would be left alone with their waiting again, not if she could help it. Shadow watched her, eyes soft, the work done. Morning came quietly, washed clean by rain. The forest loosened its grip, and a pale light rested on wet bark and tired faces, as if the night had finally decided to let them go. Ethan Moore lay on the stretcher beneath a gray sky, wrapped in a blanket that smelled faintly of antiseptic and rain. He looked older than the boy in the photograph, yet younger than the years he had carried alone. His beard was uneven, dark-threaded with early gray, his hair long and tangled, framing a face thinned by hunger but not by surrender. When his eyes opened, they moved slowly, testing the world like a man stepping onto unfamiliar ground. He did not ask where he was. He did not ask how long it had been. His gaze drifted past the lights and uniforms until it found Shadow. The German shepherd stood close, mud-dried fur clinging to his legs, chest rising and falling with steady breath. Ethan's lips parted. His voice came thin, fragile, but sure. "The dog?" he whispered. He came back. Laura felt the words settle deep inside her, heavier than any confession. She leaned closer, her eyes bright with a strength that had been waiting years to be used. "Yes," she said softly. "He did." Shadow's tail moved once, slow and certain, as if answering a promise made long ago. The ambulance doors closed with a gentle finality, and the road out of the forest opened ahead. At the hospital, time moved differently. Nurses spoke in calm tones. Machines hummed. Ethan's body was tended with careful hands, but it was his spirit that drew the quiet attention. A woman arrived before noon, hair silvered, coat too thin for the season. Her name was Margaret Moore. She was in her late 60s, her posture held upright by habit, more than comfort, eyes worn but alert. She had aged in waiting. When she saw Ethan, she did not rush. She stopped at the doorway, one hand to her mouth, as if afraid that belief might break him. Ethan looked at her, searching. Recognition came slowly, like dawn. "Mom," he said, the word rough from disuse. Margaret crossed the room then, every step careful, every breath counted. She touched his face with trembling fingers, not to claim him, but to be sure he was real. Laura watched from the hall, Shadow at her side, and felt a quiet easing in her chest. This was not a miracle that erased the past. It was something gentler. A return. Days later, the forest stood empty again. The trucks were gone. The sawdust washed into the soil. Laura returned alone with Shadow in the late afternoon, light slanting low through the trees. She carried a small metal plaque in her pocket, cool against her palm. At the base of the old oak, she knelt and pressed it into the earth. It did not speak of loss. It read simply, "Ethan Moore, found alive." Laura rested there for a while, listening to the wind move through leaves, the sound like breath finding its way home. Shadow lay beside her, eyes half closed, the work finally finished. Laura thought of all the nights. She had driven these roads believing some endings were fixed. She understood now that endings were often invitations, not conclusions. She stood, brushed the dirt from her knees, and looked once more at the tree, not as a keeper of secrets, but as a witness that had waited. Laura placed her hand on Shadow's head. "We did good," she said. The forest did not answer. It did not need to. As this story ends, remember, many quiet hearts around us carry loneliness, illness, and long nights of waiting. If you are watching this alone, you are not forgotten. Your life still matters. Your breath still has purpose. May God watch over your health, ease your pain, and bring peace to your days. If this story touched you, please share it, leave a comment, and subscribe, so no one has to feel invisible again.